Hey guys, Chris Fix here, and today I'm going to show you how to install coilovers in your car or truck. In this case, we'll be installing front coilovers, which are these right here, and rear coilovers, which are these right here, as well as our camber caster plates so that we could adjust our camber and caster alignment in our car. And I'm going to show you everything that you need to know, so after watching this video, you'll be able to install coilovers in your very own vehicle using common hand tools. But first, what are coilovers and what's the benefit to installing them? A coilover is exactly how it sounds. It's a coil spring that sits over a shock. The coil spring is what supports the weight of the vehicle, and the shock controls the motion of the spring and the car's weight transfer. On my car, we're going to be removing the spring, which is right here, and the shock in the form of a strut, which is right here, and we'll be replacing both of those with our coilover. Now, the main benefit of running coilovers is all the adjustability these give you. For example, ride height adjustability. You turn these nuts right here and we could change the ride height on our car. So we could go from this monster truck Mustang to this, a sleek lowered sports car. And not only will lowering the car a couple of inches make it look so much better, but lowering the car is also going to lower the center of gravity so the car is more stable going around turns. Another benefit of coilovers is that you could customize the spring rate for your application, whether you're drifting, you're drag racing, you're autocrossing, or you're driving on the street and you just want something a little more sporty. And spring rate is the amount of weight or force it takes to compress a spring a given distance. So if you're using 250 pound-inch springs, that means it takes 250 pounds to compress that spring 1 inch. And if you wanted to compress the spring another inch, it takes another 250 pounds. And the good thing about these springs is they're really easy to switch out. All you have to do is change the springs on your coilovers. And the final benefit could be found on higher end coilovers, and that's the ability to adjust damping. So for our front coilovers, we have double adjustable damping, and for our rear coilovers, we have single adjustable damping. So up front, we're going to be able to adjust the compression and the rebound of our shock. All we have to do to adjust the compression, if we want to make it stiffer, we just turn the knob to the plus direction, and then now the shock's harder to compress. And rebound is the exact opposite. So we could turn this to make the rebound stiffer, so it's harder to move back out. So all these adjustments on coilovers is really what's going to allow us to dial in this car and get it the way we want it. So we're going to be able to lower the car, lower the center of gravity, we're going to be able to run stiffer springs for less body roll, and we're going to be able to adjust the damping of the suspension. So all of that sounds awesome. Now let me show you how to install coilovers. And before we jack the car up and take the wheels off, you want to try to find a place on the driveway that's relatively flat. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a ride height measurement on all four corners. And you want to measure each corner of the car the same way. So I'm measuring it through the center of the wheel to the bottom of the fender. And this is 28 inches. So I went and measured all four corners of the car, and we'll reference these numbers later on when we lower the car. Now let's get the car jacked up in the air. So we're going to jack up the front end, place our jack stands underneath the car, and rest the frame of the car on the jack stands. As always, anytime you lift up the vehicle, it's a good idea to give it a nice strong shake to make sure it feels solid and doesn't move, and it's always a good idea to chalk off your rear wheels. And for even more safety, I like putting the wheel under the frame of the car. And now we have access to our suspension. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the brakes, and then we're going to loosen up our sway bar end link so that we could drop the suspension down, which will allow us to remove this coil spring and the strut so that we can replace it with our coilover. We're also going to be installing the camber caster plate, which could be found in the engine bay right at the top of the strut tower. But first, let's focus on dropping the suspension. So we're going to start with removing the brakes, and to do that, we need to get to the caliper bolts behind the caliper. So let's work with the car and turn the steering wheel to get to the two caliper bolts right back here. So let's go and remove those bolts. They're 15 millimeter. Yeah, right, that's not going to happen. We're going to have to use a breaker bar. But that's okay, because our breaker bar makes easy work breaking loose the top bolt and the bottom bolt. Now we can get our ratchet and loosen up these bolts. That's the top bolt, and that's the bottom. Next, grab a bucket or something that you could use to support the caliper, just like that. And then remove the brake rotor. And the whole point of removing the caliper from the suspension is so when we drop the suspension down, we're not pulling on the brake line, which will damage it. We also want to make sure that we take off the top bolt here on the sway bar end link, which is also preventing our suspension from dropping down. This is a 15 millimeter nut, so loosen it up. Good. And remove the bushing as well. And with that sway bar end link nut removed, the only thing holding our suspension up is this strut right here. And you want to be very careful because this spring is under tremendous force. It's forcing the control arm downwards, and this strut here is holding it up. So if we just remove these two bolts from the strut, this control arm could go flying downwards and this spring could come flying out, and that's a dangerous situation. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab our jack and slide it under the control arm and jack up the control arm just a little bit to support the suspension. So with our jack holding the control arm up, putting pressure against that coil spring, we could safely remove the two bolts holding in the strut. So grab a wrench and a 24mm socket and loosen up the top bolt. And this bolt isn't budging, so screw the nut back on the tip of the bolt so we could tap it with a hammer. Perfect. Now let's do the same thing for the bottom bolt. Unscrew it almost all the way and pop it out with a hammer. Just a little wiggle and it's out. Now we could separate the strut and the knuckle. Good. And with the strut and knuckle separated, the only thing holding in the strut is that bolt right there at the strut tower. And this bolt could be somewhat tricky. You can't just put a wrench on here and turn it because you could see the strut shaft also turns. So what you have to do is you have to get a wrench and then a flathead screwdriver in that slot and turn it. And this is coming off surprisingly easy, but if it doesn't, you could always use a little bit of penetrating fluid to help loosen it up. And once the nut is pretty loose, you're gonna wanna grab onto the strut because it's gonna just drop once this nut comes off. And with the strut removed, we're not done yet. We need something from this strut. So take the dust cover off. There it is. We have a bump stop, which is a good idea to put on our coilover. This acts as a cushion if the coilover is compressed all the way. So with our coilover ready to go, next let's install the camber caster plate. This will allow us to adjust the caster, which is back and forth, and the camber, which is side to side. Since we're gonna be lowering the car, that's gonna affect our alignment, and we're gonna have to adjust the camber. So it's important that you run a camber caster plate if you don't have an adjustable strut mount. So now we could remove the stock strut mount. There's 3 bolts holding it in and then 2 rivets back here that we have to drill out. So first, let's remove the 3 bolts. That's 1, 2, and 3. And that's the bottom part of the plate. And look here, this is interesting. It looks like somebody forgot to finish this rivet from the factory. So now we only have 1 rivet we need to remove, and it's that one right there. And what we're gonna do is drill it out. While you drill, if the rivet just spins and you're not getting anywhere, turn the drill a little so you drill at an angle and break the rivet. And there we go, the top plate is removed. Now knock the rest of the rivet out of the hole. Good. And don't forget to clean the area with some soapy water so the new camber caster plate could sit flat on the strut tower surface. And don't worry, I'll be doing an engine bay cleaning video very soon. Now the camber caster plate installation is pretty simple. You separate it like that, and the bottom piece goes under the strut tower, and the top piece sits on top of that. The only problem we have is there's 4 studs here, but only 3 holes here. So we're gonna have to drill another hole right about here, but we can't do it about there. We have to find exactly where it's gonna be. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna paint the top of the bolt, get a nice thick layer of paint on there, and then flip the plate over. And now there are slots here. So we're gonna make our first mark at one side of the slot, and then slide it to the other side and make another mark. And that worked awesome. We have a mark there and a mark there for this slot. Now I'm gonna use the middle of those 2 marks and use a center punch to make a dimple for our drill bit. Next, we're gonna drill our hole out, so add some oil to the bit for some lubrication. I'm starting with a smaller bit to drill a pilot hole. Then you can move to your full-size bit, and these cobalt bits cut through that hardened steel like a hot knife through butter. And anytime you drill or cut metal, you want to get a little touch-up paint around the edges and inside so it doesn't rust. Now let's install the bottom plate and see how we did. Beautiful, that fits perfect. So add a washer to each stud, then add the top plate, and hand tighten the 4 nuts to hold it together. And that's how you install camber caster plates. It's very simple to do. We're using the nice 4-bolt design instead of the stock 3-bolt design. This is a lot more sturdy, and this is gonna give us a lot of alignment adjustability for when we lower the car with our coilovers. So now what we're gonna be doing is we need to remove the coil spring here. That's the last thing we need to do before we could install the coilover. And remember, this is under tremendous amount of pressure here. So we don't want to just drop the jack and then that comes flying out because that could be dangerous. We're going to slowly let the jack down and depressurize this coil spring. And we don't want to stand right in front of the spring either. Move off to the side so that the car is protecting your body and you're not directly in line with the spring just in case it does come flying out. It shouldn't if we do this slowly. So slowly let that control arm down. And once it's down all the way, you might need to use a pry bar to help you remove the spring the rest of the way. And with the spring removed, we could install the coilover. Now this is easy. Get the coilover and you're gonna push the top up through the camber caster plate like that. And be sure to have the washer and nut ready. And once the nut's on, the coilover is held in place so you can just let go. Now we could bolt the coilover into the knuckle. So jack up the control arm to raise the knuckle up so it's even with the coilover. And then line them up and shimmy them together so they fit. Then get that top bolt in and the bottom bolt, and then add the top nut and bottom nut. And with those 2 bolts in, now we're gonna grab our medium strength thread locker, and right where the nut is gonna tighten up against the coilover, add some thread locker on the top bolt and on the bottom bolt. And we're using medium strength thread locker because this is a high vibration area, being that it's the suspension. So this is gonna prevent any vibrations from loosening up those bolts. Now we wanna tighten these bolts to 150 foot-pounds of torque. That's one, and that's the other. And with the 2 coilover to knuckle bolts torqued down, now we could go and tighten up the sway bar end link. So we'll add our bushing and the nut, and this nut's supposed to be torqued down to around 14 foot-pounds, or just enough so that it's snug and compressing the bushing. Good, and with that tightened down, let's go to the top up here and get our camber caster plates adjusted and tightened down. Now, as the name implies, we could adjust our caster, which is in this direction, and looks like this. You could see the coilover moving forwards and backwards. And we could adjust our camber, which is in this direction, and that tilts the wheel. Let me show you that with the wheel on. So the top of the wheel could move inwards, which is negative camber, or outwards, which is positive camber. And for now, I'm just gonna be eyeballing this alignment. I'm not gonna get it perfect. I'm gonna take this car in for a laser alignment. I wanna try to get this side to match with the other side, which, by the way, is identical. So everything we're doing on this side, putting the coilover in, all that stuff, is going to be the exact same process on the other side. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna try to get this caster right in the middle, which is right about there. And these bolts should be tightened down to 40 foot-pounds, but I'm just gonna snug them up for now because I really don't know if this alignment for the caster is gonna be good or not. So for now, just get these 4 bolts snugged up so you could drive it to the alignment shop. So now that our caster is adjusted, it won't move back and forth, we could adjust our camber. And since this is a drift car, I'm gonna put the camber all the way to the negative settings for now. We'll see how that looks. Snug that up, good. Now our caster and our camber is set. Now let's tighten down the coilover bolt. For this, we get a wrench over the nut and a little wrench on the top of the stud, and we just tighten it down. Since we need to have this little wrench on the top, we can't torque it down, so I'm just gonna tighten it so it's nice and tight, just like that. It's always a good idea to get your paint marker and mark the bolt and the stud. So now if this bolt loosens up, you'll see, because this straight line here won't be aligned anymore. All right, with the caster and camber plate nuts tightened down, as well as the coilover nut, we are so close to finishing this front coilover. All we have to do now is get the brakes in, and then we can lower the car down and see how it looks. So let's finish this up. We're gonna put the brake rotor on, and then slide the caliper over the rotor. Now hand tighten the top bolt and the bottom bolt, and then torque both bolts down to 95 foot-pounds. Good. And before we put the wheel back on to lower the car, let's adjust our damping. So we have compression and rebound. There's 18 clicks of adjustment on each knob. It was suggested to me that we run 3 clicks up of compression and halfway or 9 clicks up of rebound. And then you could go for your test drive and see if you need to adjust these. Next, let's lower the jack and move it out of the way. And with the suspension unloaded, there's one more thing that we need to do, and that is adjust our ride height and tighten these jam nuts. Now I say with the suspension unloaded because you want to have the tires off the ground when you're adjusting the ride height so there's no pressure on this spring. And you can see here there's 2 nuts. There's one up here, this is the spring seat nut. If you turn this in one direction, you can see we're raising the height of the vehicle. So we could raise the height all the way up to the top threads right up here. And then if we turn this in the other direction, you could see that we're lowering the height of the vehicle. And then let's just say you want the ride height setting to be right there. This bottom nut is the jam nut, and what you do is you just tighten this up against the spring seat nut that we're just adjusting, and then that locks it in place. You want the ride height on this coilover to match the ride height on the other coilover, so your front end sits level. And to make that easy, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set this to the lowest ride height setting on both sides. Once we get to the lowest setting, you wanna turn these nuts into each other, and these coilovers come with wrenches to help you grab onto these nuts so you can get more leverage and lock them into place. Now the ride height is locked in, and we are done. And that is how you install coilovers. Really not difficult. You could easily do it at home. Now I cannot wait to see how this car looks when we lower it down to the ground. But before we put the wheels on, I want to mention something. Make sure you buy some quality coilovers. This is a main part of your suspension. This is acting like your strut and your spring together, and kind of like an upper control arm. So not only is the quality important for how the car handles and feels, but it's also important for safety. Alright, with the front coilovers installed, let's put the wheels on, remove the jack stands, and slowly drop her down. I cannot wait to see how this car looks. Oh man, and there's our first problem. So already we're dealing with problems that you get with lowered cars, just like our jack, which is definitely hitting the frame at the front here, and it's definitely not going to clear. I'm never going to be able to pull this out. So we're going to have to jack this up slightly and get a couple of pieces of wood underneath the front tires and then let the car down again, and that gives us enough clearance to pull the jack out. And holy smokes, you guys said you wanted to see the drift staying lowered? Well, check that out. That looks awesome. It looks so good. Not only does it look good, I can't wait to see how it's going to function on the track and on the road. So let's see how much we dropped it. So I got a tape measure, and we'll measure the same exact way we did before, and we're at 25.5 inches, and the suspension isn't even settled. Before, we were at 28 inches, so we dropped 2.5 inches. And another thing we want to look at is our camber, and I'm going to take this car to get aligned. But for now, you can see I have a lot of negative camber, which is perfect for the track. If you're driving this on the street, you don't want to put too much negative camber, you'll eat up your tires. But because the top of our tire is tucked in a little bit that way, it's a good idea to get your hand back in here and just make sure that you have clearance between the coilover and the wheel. And we have plenty of room here. So there you go. I couldn't have asked for a better install on the front coilovers. That looks awesome. I can't wait to try it out on the track, but we're not done yet. We still have to do the rear coilovers. And because that's totally different, since we have a solid rear axle compared to an independent suspension in the front, I'm going to do another video on that. It's going to be filled with even more information, and I'm going to show you the car dropped completely down, the way it's going to sit. I'm going to get it aligned, and we're going to go for a test drive. So as always, I hope the video was helpful. If it was, remember to give it a thumbs up. Stay tuned for that next video. All the products I used in this video, coilovers, camber caster plates, and tools are linked in the description. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And the next video will be linked right on the side there. Just click on the screen over on the right or find the link in the description below.